Hello, we would like to welcome you to today's webinar on the proposed National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard. You can download a copy of the webinar slides from the USDA Bioengineered Food Disclosure Labeling Standard website at www.ams.usda.gov/BE. The material we are going to cover is complex. The goal of this webinar is to provide a detailed overview of the proposed labeling standard and the expected costs and impacts to affected parties. As we move through the presentation, please keep in mind that we are very interested in your feedback and suggestions on the proposed standard. The best way for you to provide us with this feedback is by submitting a formal comment through the rulemaking portal at regulations.gov. The exact link is on our BE labeling website. Comments must be submitted through regulations.gov by July 3rd. Comments submitted by email to BE Food Disclosure, that's BEFOODDISCLOSURE at ams.usda.gov will not be considered. We will rely on your feedback to develop the final bioengineered food labeling standard. So let's begin. On May 4th, 2018, the United States Department of Agriculture published a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register to establish a national mandatory bioengineered food disclosure standard. The purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of the proposal. The proposal is divided into three major sections: applicability, disclosure, and administrative provisions. We will discuss each of these sections in turn. We will also provide an overview of the regulatory flexibility analysis and the regulatory impact analysis. On July 29, 2016, Public Law 114-216 amended the Agricultural Marketing Act of 1946. The amended act directs the Secretary to establish the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard for disclosing bioengineered or BE food and food that may be bioengineered nationwide. We will refer to the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard as the standard or the NBFDS throughout this webinar. We will now describe the proposed standard, including the requirements and procedures. We will start with the applicability section of the proposed rule. What foods would be subject to the disclosure under the proposed standard? Foods subject to the labeling requirements of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FDCA, are subject to the proposed rule. In addition, foods subject to the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, or the Egg Products Inspection Act are subject to the proposed rule with certain conditions. As set forth in the amended Act, foods subject to the labeling requirements of the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, or the Egg Products Inspection Act are subject to the proposed rule if the most predominant ingredient of the food would independently be subject to the labeling requirements under the FDCA, or if the most predominant ingredient of the food is broth, stock, water, or a similar solution, and the second most predominant ingredient of the food would independently be subject to the labeling requirements under the FDCA. As the preamble describes, we are proposing to use the same methods the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, uses to identify predominance. And this can be found at 21 CFR 101.4A1. The amended Agricultural Marketing Act defines the word bioengineering with respect to a food. That same definition was used for the proposed rule and incorporates the amended Act's language into the regulatory definition of bioengineered food. The proposed rule requests comment on two viewpoints regarding the interpretation of the definition of bioengineered food. Position 1 maintains that food is bioengineered only if it contains detectable modified genetic material. Proponents of this position would contend that refined products do not contain modified genetic material and therefore do not meet the definition of bioengineering. Position 2 would require disclosure for foods and ingredients produced from bioengineered crops, even if the modified genetic material is not detectable. For example, with respect to refined sugar produced from bioengineered sugar beets, proponents of position 2 would contend that even if the final product, the refined sugar, does not contain detectable modified genetic material, that would not definitively mean that there was no such modified genetic material. Proponents of this position would maintain that refined products should be presumed to meet the definition of bioengineering because they were produced from bioengineered crops. The definition of bioengineered food would also state that the modification could not otherwise be obtained through conventional breeding or found in nature. As to the definition's component terms, the proposed rule seeks comment on whether conventional breeding and found in nature should be defined, and if so, what those definitions should be. In an attempt to make it easier and less burdensome for consumers and regulated entities to understand what products may need to be disclosed under the proposal, AMS has proposed two lists. First, a proposed list of BE foods that are commercially available in the United States with a high adoption rate, and second, a proposed list of BE foods that are commercially available in the United States that are not highly adopted. Only foods or products on either of these lists or made from foods on either of the lists would be subject to disclosure under the NBFDS. The first lists include canola, field corn, cotton, soybean, and sugar beet. Proposed Section 66.1 would define this first list as one maintained by AMS and consists of commercially available BE foods that have an adoption rate of 85% or more in the United States as determined by the Economic Research Service or any successor agency. The second list includes non-browning apple cultivars, sweet corn, papaya, potato, and summer squash varieties. The second list consists of commercially available BE foods with an adoption rate of less than 85% in the United States. To compile the proposed lists, AMS considered data reported by USDA's Economic Research Service, data published by the International Service for the Acquisition of Agribiotech Applications, and FDA's list of biotechnology consultations on food from GE plant varieties. The foods on the proposed initial lists are included in FDA's list of biotechnology consultations on food from GE plant varieties, produced anywhere in the world, and are commercially available for retail sale in the United States. AMS proposes to have the lists reviewed and revised on an annual basis through Federal Register notices. Interested parties would be invited to recommend additions to and subtractions from the two lists and to provide data supporting those recommendations. Comments would be solicited on those recommendations, and AMS would then determine whether revisions to the list would be appropriate. The proposal includes an 18-month grace period to allow regulated entities time to revise food labels appropriately following revisions to the two lists of commercially available BE foods in the United States. As to specific technologies, the proposed process for establishing and amending the BE foods list would provide a vehicle for AMS to evaluate whether a particular crop meets the definition of bioengineering. The proposal also establishes a process for requesting and granting a determination by the Secretary regarding other factors and conditions under which a food is considered a bioengineered food. In order for a request to be considered, a person would have to submit a request or petition to the Secretary's designee, who is the AMS administrator. For purposes of transparency, the proposal includes standards for consideration by which the AMS administrator would evaluate the request or petition. Those standards include, first, whether the requested factor or condition is within the scope of the definition of bioengineering within the amended Act. Second, the cost of implementation and compliance related to the factor or condition. And third, other relevant information, such as the requested factor or condition's compatibility with food labeling requirements of other federal agencies or foreign governments. If the administrator then determines that the request or petition satisfies the standards for consideration, AMS would initiate rulemaking that seeks to amend the definition of bioengineered food in proposed section 66.1 to include the factor or condition. The proposed rule explores two requests for factors and conditions that AMS has determined meet the proposed standard for consideration. First, whether incidental additives present in food should be considered bioengineered food and labeled accordingly. Second, whether the modified genetic material in a food may be detected. Earlier in the webinar, we described two viewpoints on the interpretation of the definition of bioengineered food. If AMS ultimately decides to proceed with position 2, which includes refined ingredients within the definition of bioengineered food, this factor or condition would be a means to potentially exclude products where modified genetic material cannot be detected. The proposed definition of bioengineered food includes the first requested factor or condition, these are incidental additives, but does not include the second, which is detection. AMS seeks comment on whether the final rule should incorporate one or both of them into the definition of bioengineered food. The impact of adopting these factors or conditions would be to limit the scope of the definition of bioengineered food, thus potentially excluding certain products from disclosure. The proposed rule also includes several exemptions to the disclosure standard. First, food served in a restaurant or similar retail food establishment would be exempt. Second, very small food manufacturers, both domestic and foreign, would also be exempt. The proposed rule defines very small food manufacturers as any food manufacturer with annual receipts of less than $2.5 million. The amended Agricultural Marketing Act directs the Secretary to establish a threshold level for the amount of bioengineered substance for determining whether a food must bear a BE disclosure. A food in which the bioengineered substance is below the threshold would not be required to have a BE disclosure. The proposed rule indicates three alternative thresholds, which are 1, food in which an ingredient contains a BE substance that is inadvertent or technically unavoidable and accounts for no more than 5% by weight of the specific ingredient. 2, food in which an ingredient contains a BE substance that is inadvertent or technically unavoidable and accounts for no more than 0.9% by weight of the specific ingredient. And 3, food in which the ingredient or ingredients that contains a bioengineered substance account for no more than 5% of the total weight of the food in final form. Further, the proposed rule also incorporates the amended Act's exemption, prohibiting a food derived from an animal from being considered a bioengineered food solely because the animal consumed feed produced from, containing, or consisting of a bioengineered substance. As it relates to the National Organic Program, the proposed rule also exempts certified organic foods from the bioengineered food disclosure. Okay, now we will cover who would be required to disclose, what the disclosure would look like, and how the disclosure should occur. Generally, if you are a food manufacturer, food importer, or food retailer in certain situations, you would be responsible for disclosing the presence of bioengineered food or bioengineered food ingredients in the foods that you process and or sell. The amended Act requires that the disclosures be made using text, a symbol, or through certain electronic means. Please note, if you import food into the United States, you would also be subject to the same disclosure and compliance requirements as domestic entities. We are interested in the impact of these types of requirements on importers and would consider implementation of a mutual recognition type of arrangement as a way to better streamline trade. We are specifically requesting comments on these types of mutual recognition agreements. As we mentioned earlier, to help clarify whether or not a whole food or ingredient should be disclosed, we are proposing a list of bioengineered foods that are highly adopted, meaning that over the last few years, bioengineered crops have been used in more than 85% of the plantings of these crops in the United States. Again, highly adopted commercially available bioengineered foods would include canola, field corn, cotton, soybean, and sugar beet. Since bioengineered versions of the foods on this list are highly adopted in the marketplace, we assume that a food from this list would likely be bioengineered. We have also proposed a list of bioengineered foods that are not highly adopted, meaning that bioengineered crops have been used in less than 85% of the planted acreage of these crops in the United States. Commercially available bioengineered foods that are not highly adopted would include non-browning cultivars of apples, sweet corn, papaya, potato, and summer squash. As a reminder, the purpose of these lists is to provide a straightforward means of determining whether or not a particular food might require disclosure. Basically, if a food or food ingredient is on either of these lists or made from a food on these lists, regulated entities would need to make a disclosure consistent with the standard or no disclosure, depending on whether the food is bioengineered. For foods or food ingredients on the high adoption list, regulated entities will be required to label the food with the terms bioengineered food or contains a bioengineered food ingredient. They could also use the symbol or an electronic disclosure, depending on the form of disclosure that best meets customer expectations. Foods on the non-highly adopted list would also be able to bear the may be bioengineered food disclosure. In developing these disclosure requirements, USDA has tried to balance flexibility for regulated entities while ensuring that consumers have a clear understanding of the bioengineered content of food they're buying. For this reason, we are proposing to require labels to be of sufficient size and clarity and to appear prominently on food packages. This way, it is more likely to be read and understood by the consumer under ordinary shopping conditions. The placement of the disclosure on the food packaging should be in a place where consumers who are interested in additional food information typically look for information about their food. Generally, this information is found on the information panel or the principal display panel. These are the places on food packaging where manufacturers include the ingredient list, the manufacturer name and address, and if applicable, the country of origin. These are the places to also require a disclosure for bioengineered food or bioengineered food ingredients. Now back to the lists. For food on the non-highly adopted list, we're actually proposing several disclosure options. For BE foods commercially available but not highly adopted in the United States, the disclosure would be made using one of the following statements. Bioengineered food, may be bioengineered food, contains a bioengineered food ingredient, or may contain a bioengineered food ingredient. We are particularly interested in your input on these topics. Please provide us with your comments on the use of the term may and on how bioengineered foods on either of the lists should be required to be disclosed. A symbol is another way to disclose the presence of bioengineered food or bioengineered food ingredients. We have proposed 3 alternative symbols. There are several options included in the proposed rule, all 3 of which include some variations of the letter B and E, which is short for bioengineered. We seek comment on the alternatives and the variations of the symbols. We have also proposed another disclosure option that would allow the use of electronic or digital link printed on food packaging to provide consumers with information on bioengineered food ingredients. Currently, there is technology available, including quick response codes or QR codes and digital watermark technology. We are proposing that food packages must provide clear instructions to consumers. For example, scan anywhere on package for more food information or scan icon for more food information. Now, in compliance with the amended Act, USDA completed a study to identify potential technological challenges that may impact whether consumers would have access to the bioengineering disclosure through electronic or digital disclosure methods. The study considered 5 factors: the availability of wireless internet or cellular networks, the availability of landline telephones in stores, challenges facing small and rural retailers, the efforts that retailers and other entities have taken to address potential technology and infrastructure challenges, and the costs and benefits of installing in retail stores electronic or digital link scanners or other evolving technology that provides bioengineered disclosure information. Now, the study found that the majority of Americans own a smartphone. This is at 77%, and that ownership rates are trending upward. that most Americans live in areas with sufficient broadband access, about 93.6%, to be able to scan a digital link to access bioengineering food disclosure information, that all national chain stores and most regional chain stores, around 97%, do in fact provide Wi-Fi in stores, that of small retailers, 37% already provide Wi-Fi to consumers in stores, that consumers may recognize digital links but lack familiarity with scanning, that many consumers, around 85%, experience technical challenges using certain mobile software applications or apps for scanning digital links, and that scanning digital links requires access to the internet. Therefore, some retailers may need to install Wi-Fi networks for consumers without access to cellular data or local Wi-Fi networks. The study is under review, and the Secretary has not yet made a determination regarding whether consumers, while shopping, would not have sufficient access to the bioengineering disclosure through electronic or digital disclosure methods. We are proposing disclosure through a text message that would operate similarly to the electronic or digital disclosure in the event that the Secretary makes such a determination. A text message would be a means for consumers that do not have access to broadband internet or a smartphone to access the disclosure. Now, we've worked to provide flexible electronic disclosure options that reflect constantly changing technology. The proposed rule also includes flexibilities for small food manufacturers. Small food manufacturers are defined in the proposed rule as any food manufacturer with less than $10 million in annual receipts, but more than $2.5 million in annual receipts. This is similar to the FDA definition of small food manufacturer. The proposed rule includes the option for small food manufacturers to provide disclosures through a telephone number or internet website that consumers can call or access for additional food information. Additionally, the standard proposes flexible disclosure options for food contained in small or very small packages. Similarly, we have proposed additional flexibilities for foods sold in bulk containers. These are foods such as cornmeal or dried fruits that are sold in a bulk bin in a grocery store. For these foods, the proposed rule allows for disclosure using any of the options for on-package disclosure, including text, symbol, or electronic or digital link, or text message, if applicable. The disclosure would be required to appear on signage or other materials, such as stickers, on or near the bulk items. This would allow the consumer to easily identify and understand the bioengineered status of the food. Finally, we would permit voluntary disclosure of the presence of bioengineered food or food ingredients. Entities who are responsible for disclosure would have the option to disclose bioengineering information for foods that may not be subject to mandatory disclosure. To ensure that any business that wants to provide disclosure has the option to disclose bioengineering information regarding foods that may not be subject to mandatory disclosure, the proposed rule allows voluntary labeling of food that meets the definition of bioengineered food. Now we're going to shift gears and discuss certain administrative provisions, including record keeping and enforcement. This section is intended for all regulated entities. Keep in mind that regulated entities are subject to enforcement actions, including USDA audit. The amended act provides the amended act prohibits failure to disclose a BE food or BE food ingredient. If the results of an audit find that certain food ingredients or products are not properly disclosed, the results of such information would be made publicly available. As to record keeping, the amended act requires each entity, this can be a food manufacturer, an importer, and a retailer subject to bioengineered food disclosure, to maintain customary and reasonable business records to demonstrate compliance with bioengineered food disclosure requirements. Our intent is to minimize compliance costs to food companies as much as possible, and we are proposing flexibility for regulated entities to decide for themselves what these typical and customary records are. As well, regulated entities would be able to choose what format to use for the records they maintain and where to store them. Pertinent records would need to be maintained for 2 years beyond the date the food product is offered for retail sale. We believe that for the most part, Manufacturers and retailers already maintain similar and consistent records. For example, purchase orders, invoices, bills of lading, organic certifications, process verifications, testing records, etc. These are the types of records that describe the origin of food and food ingredients, and the types of records that would denote whether a food is bioengineered. Now keep in mind, we are proposing certain record-keeping requirements depending on the food that regulated entities process and or sell. If you sell a food that is either on the high adoption or non-high adoption list of bioengineered foods, but do not disclose, you would be required to maintain documentation to verify that the food in question is in fact not bioengineered. Now, if you're selling a food or food product on either of the highly adopted or non-highly adopted lists, and you choose to disclose the presence of bioengineering, you would only need to maintain records to show that the food or food ingredient is on one of the lists. Similarly, if using a may claim, you would only need to demonstrate that the food is on the non-highly adopted list. Other examples of when a may claim could be used is when a manufacturer sources bioengineered and non-bioengineered versions of the same food ingredient, or when a manufacturer switches sources for a certain ingredient but does not want to modify their labels. Records would be required to be maintained for at least 2 years after the foods are distributed for retail sale. If alerted by USDA that an audit will be conducted of your records, you would have 5 business days to produce certain records. If USDA should require access to your records at your place of business, we would provide at least 3 days notice. As with other provisions in this proposed rule, we are requesting your input on the record-keeping requirements previously described. Now, as a reminder, failure to make a bioengineered food disclosure as required by the NBFDS is prohibited. Complaints about possible violations of the NBFDS would be submitted to AMS will be promptly addressed. Once we determine whether an investigation is warranted, we would conduct a records audit. Following the audit, the impacted company will be notified and informed of the results. Regulated entities would be able to appeal the results of an audit or investigation, after which AMS would notify the regulated entity of its final determination in the matter. The results of the audit or investigation would then be posted to AMS's website. We also wanted to take this opportunity to discuss the proposed effective dates for compliance with this rule. We intend that any final rule resulting from this action will be effective 60 days after the date of publication in the Federal Register. We are proposing a compliance date of January 1st, 2020, with a delayed compliance date for small food manufacturers of January 1st, 2021. These compliance dates would be aligned with certain proposed FDA requirements regarding changes to the nutrition facts and supplement facts label. We want to ensure that regulated entities have adequate time to analyze products and understand new requirements, make necessary changes to their labels, and have the chance to review and update their records and record-keeping systems. We are also proposing that entities that have previously printed labels for food packages would be allowed to use up existing supplies until January 1st, 2022. Again, we are interested in your input and we invite your comments on this approach. Okay, now we will shift the discussion to the projected impacts on small businesses and the results of the preliminary economic analysis. We evaluated the potential impact of the proposed rule specifically on small businesses as required by the Regulatory Flexibility Act. Over the next few slides, we will describe the types of small businesses that would be affected by the proposal should it be finalized in its current form. We will discuss some of the provisions of the statute that we propose to use to reduce adverse impacts on small businesses covered by the proposal. And we will discuss how we evaluated whether the rule will have a significant adverse effect on any group of businesses, large or small. The proposed rule sets out requirements that would apply directly to food manufacturers, dietary supplement manufacturers, and certain retailers. Food and supplement manufacturers are those that are responsible for packaging food for sale to the public. The manufacturer of a can of soup or a jar of multivitamins is responsible for making sure that that product is labeled correctly. Sales between vendors not intended for direct sale to the public, for example, tomato sauce sold to a manufacturer of spaghetti sauce, would not be covered under the proposed rule. Retailers that separate the product from its label, or who sell product that was never labeled, would be required to provide information on the BE status of that product at the point of sale. For example, if a retailer is selling zucchini loose in the produce section, they would be required to post information on the BE status of the zucchini in question. However, if the same retailer were selling apples that were bagged by the supplier would be responsible for the disclosure. For purposes of this analysis, we assume that all manufacturers and retailers would incur costs as a result of the rule. Manufacturing businesses are divided into 4 categories by revenue: very small manufacturers, those with revenues below $2.5 million per year; small manufacturers, those with revenues below $10 million per year; small businesses that meet the Small Business Administration definition of small business would not be considered small manufacturers for purpose of this rule; and large businesses, which are businesses that do not meet any of the definitions of small or very small. The statute provides exemptions and extensions for very small food manufacturers and small manufacturers. We do not estimate the number of retailers that would fit into these categories. However, retailers that meet the SBA definition of small account for almost 99% of all retailers. In addition to the firms directly regulated in this program, there are additional firms in other industries, particularly wholesalers, that may face consumer-driven costs associated with increased demand for BE information on intermediate ingredients or other supplies. While we do not attempt to estimate the level of these costs, we assume they are included in the cost to manufacturers. We do know that there are approximately 40,000 firms in these indirectly affected industry sectors, and that roughly 96% of them meet the SBA definition of small. The statute provides specific relief for certain classes of small businesses. The statute exempts very small food manufacturers. As mentioned, the proposal defines this to be any food manufacturer, including dietary supplements, with receipts of less than $2.5 million per year. Under this exemption, 74% of food manufacturers and 45% of dietary supplement manufacturers would be exempt from the rule. Like most industries, however, production is concentrated among the firms at the larger end of the sector, so 96% of food products would still be covered even with 74% of the firms exempt. 98% of dietary supplement products would be covered. The statute also provides additional compliance time for small food manufacturers. Small food manufacturers have an additional year to label their products. This extension can significantly reduce the cost of printing and applying labels because it gives manufacturers time to use up existing label stock, thereby reducing waste. However, the extension does not reduce administrative costs of compliance. The proposed rule uses the FDA labeling standard definition of small manufacturers. This is with receipts less than $10 million per year, since the businesses covered by both rules overlap. This helps us synchronize schedules with the FDA, further reducing wastage of labels. An additional 12% of food manufacturers, over and above those fully exempt, and 19% of dietary supplement manufacturers will receive this additional time under the proposed rule. Now, we evaluated whether the rule was likely to have a significant adverse effect on small businesses or any other business size by looking at the ratio of costs to revenue for the affected industries. To ensure that we did not miss any potential adverse effect, we used the upper bound annualized cost and a 7% discount rate, which results in higher annualized cost estimates than the 3% rate. We compared the costs for an individual revenue category to the total revenue of all firms in that category to obtain a ratio of cost to revenue. While there is no single revenue to cost ratio that can be considered acceptable across all industries, we discussed this with the Small Business Administration and decided to use 1% and 3% as indicating increasing levels of concern. As indicated on this and the following slides, costs never exceed 1% of revenue for any size class of firm. Costs do reach 1% of revenue for food manufacturers with receipts of less than $500,000, but such firms would not be covered by the rule due to the very small food manufacturer exemption. Now, for retailers, the cost to revenue ratios are all reported as zeros. What this means is that the costs of the rule are less than 0.005% of revenues. Because the cost to revenue ratio never crossed the 1% threshold, it is safe to assume that the proposed rule would not have a significant impact on a substantial number of small businesses. Please note that while the regulatory impact analysis for the proposed rule correctly states this conclusion, the notice of proposed rulemaking incorrectly states the opposite at 83 FR 19881 and 19884 by inadvertently dropping the word "not" in the statements on those pages. We will publish a correction in the Federal Register explaining the inconsistency and noting the correct conclusion for the initial regulatory flexibility analysis. Again, our preliminary conclusion is that the proposed rule would not have a significant impact on a substantial number of small businesses. Now, we will discuss the preliminary economic impact analysis. USDA estimates that the cost of the proposed NBFDS would range from $600 million to $3.5 billion for the initial year, with ongoing annual costs of between $114 million and $225 million. The annualized costs would be $132 million to $330 million at a 3% discount rate and $156 million to $471 million at a 7% discount rate. This can be found in Table 1. This estimate incorporates a definition of small manufacturer of less than $10 million of annual revenue. Small manufacturers have an extra year to comply, keep in mind, and a definition of very small manufacturer of less than $2.5 million of annual revenue. And don't forget that very small manufacturers are exempt from this law. This estimate is for the case where no foods are exempted from the NBFDS, though it should be noted that none of the cost estimates in this RIA examine the BE status or potential cost of disclosure of those incidental additives that do not have to be listed on food labels, since USDA had no information on which to assess the inclusion and BE content of such ingredients. Now, even leaving aside incidental additives, the proposed rule still has the potential to cover a large number of products. USDA analyzed product labels using the Label Insight data to find that approximately 75% of products for sale in the United States contain one or more ingredients, as shown in Table 5, that could potentially be BE. Now, a similar table in the RIA shows the top 20 ingredients for dietary supplements. However, not all of the 75% of products with a potential BE ingredient will generate any costs under the proposed rule. Zero cost products include organic products, which are exempt from mandatory disclosure under the statute, non-GMO certified products, which are assumed to already meet the requirements of the proposed rule, and products for which the primary ingredient is meat, since these products are not covered by FDA labeling regulations. The remaining 65% of food products and 80% of dietary supplements contain ingredients that could trigger disclosure and therefore generate costs under the proposed rule. Now that we've established coverage of the rule, let's take a closer look at what is driving its high costs. As outlined in Table 1, the cost estimate is composed of three elements: administrative costs, physical labeling costs, and BE replacement costs. The first set of costs, which are administrative costs, are the costs to manufacturers and retailers for analyzing the rule to figure out if they need to label any of their products. Administrative costs vary depending on how difficult it is to figure out which ingredients are potentially BE and would need to be disclosed. The USDA BE lists will help to contain these costs by providing clear information to manufacturers and retailers about those BE foods subject to disclosure. Thanks to the lists, a grocer selling tomatoes, for example, would not have to investigate whether or not BE tomatoes are currently marketed in the United States. He or she would simply need to consult the USDA BE lists to learn that his or her tomatoes are not subject to disclosure. The lists do not, however, lower costs so dramatically for all ingredients. For example, while manufacturers of pasta sauce should consult the USDA BE lists to easily determine that tomatoes do not trigger disclosure, they would have a harder time determining whether the citric acid and spices in the sauce need disclosure. These types of ingredients would entail higher administrative costs. As shown in Table 8B, USDA included 3 levels of administrative costs to account for the difficulty of determining whether the ingredients in a product triggers disclosure. All in all, the administrative costs account for well over half, actually almost 3/4, of initial first-year costs of the proposed rule. The second type of costs, physical labeling costs, are those related to designing, printing, and applying the physical label to those products that require labeling. These costs are highly sensitive to the compliance period, the amount of time manufacturers have to comply with this rule. The shorter the compliance period, the greater the amount of existing label stock that manufacturers cannot use. This raises the cost of compliance. Now, under the proposed rule, USDA seeks to minimize physical labeling costs by including a label use-up allowance that allows manufacturers to use up any existing labels printed before publication of the final NBFDS rule, with the requirement that all labels printed after January of 2020 contain the required BE disclosure. For the purposes of calculating printing costs, this is the practical equivalent of a 39-month compliance period, while ensuring disclosure occurs as expeditiously and practically within those 39 months. An alternative compliance period of 15 months with no label use-up resulted in substantially higher labeling costs. Tables 11 and 11A show large reductions in cost from the label use-up option, with savings ranging from $1 billion to almost $3 billion for food manufacturers across the 3 definitions of very small, and from $77 million to $131 million for dietary supplement manufacturers. In addition to manufacturers, retailers would also incur direct costs associated with the rule. Most of the products sold by retailers will already be labeled by the manufacturer or processor in packaging. However, items such as produce are often sold intact and without packaging. If these products are not already labeled by suppliers, the retailer would be responsible for labeling the items or providing information through other point-of-sale materials. The first costs retailers would incur are the administrative analysis costs related to determining the applicability of the law. USDA assumed that firms with multiple establishments would centralize these costs at the headquarters level or the firm level, so that administrative costs are incurred only there. As shown in Table 12, total administrative costs would be $17 million to $138 million. The second set of costs to retailers is the signage cost to provide consumers information about the BE status of the product. These costs would be incurred at each establishment, not just at headquarters, and for each potentially BE product. Of the produce on the USDA list of commercially available BE foods, only 3 types are currently offered for bulk, unpackaged, and undifferentiated sale. These are sweet corn, zucchini or summer squash, and papaya. The non-browning BE potatoes currently on the market are sold in bags with QR codes and are segregated from non-BE varieties. Likewise, non-browning BE apples are trademarked and sold as bagged slices. Grocers would not have to take extra steps to provide signage for these products since they are packaged. USDA therefore assumed 3 signs per establishment for sweet corn, zucchini, and papaya for a total cost between $4 million and $41 million. The third type of costs included in USDA's cost estimates are the BE replacement costs. To avoid potential negative consumer reaction to products labeled BE, some manufacturers and retailers might choose to reformulate away from BE ingredients or replace BE ingredients with non-BE counterparts to avoid having to put the BE disclosure on their products. How many manufacturers decide to do this and for how many products depends on their prediction of how consumers will react to the BE labels. Market observations, hypothetical market experiments, and surveys of consumer attitudes provide mixed evidence as to probable consumer reaction and market outcomes. The lack of unambiguous predictors has resulted in a wide range of predicted impacts. For its analysis, USDA assumed that potential consumer reaction to BE labeling will drive manufacturers to avoid labeling 20% of their products as BE. In other words, USDA assumed that manufacturers and retailers would convert around 20% of products to verified non-BE products. The marketing decision to replace BE ingredients with their non-BE counterparts entails higher costs stretching back to the farm. The extra cost to farmers of supplying non-BE commodities and crops include the cost of sourcing non-BE seeds, avoiding cross-contamination with BE varieties during planting, harvesting, and transporting, driving to an elevator or a handler that is farther away from the nearest bulk elevator, and foregoing the benefits of BE production. To maintain the integrity of the non-BE commodity or crop once it leaves the farm, grain handlers and distributors will need to ensure that non-BE varieties are not mixed or cross-contaminated with BE varieties. This can be achieved by either adjusting existing systems to accommodate handling both BE and non-BE varieties, or converting some facilities and systems into specialized non-BE systems. For non-dedicated systems, BE segregation will require thorough cleaning of facilities, storage bins, trucks, and hoppers before handling BE varieties. In some cases, handlers may have to invest in additional containers that can be securely sealed to prevent cross-contamination. USDA estimates that total non-BE segregation costs would add up to between $100 million for a purity threshold of 5% to $198 million with a more stringent purity level of 0.9%. Since manufacturers of dietary supplements use food-grade inputs, these segregation costs include costs to these manufacturers as well. Assuming that 20% of retailers also decide to pursue a non-BE strategy, this is equal to 20% of retail sales, their segregation costs would equal around $8 million annually, with no variation in cost due to purity threshold. In total, USDA estimates initial administrative costs plus segregation costs at between $213 million and $1.010 billion for food and dietary supplement manufacturers, and between $11 million and $36 million for retailers. USDA estimates ongoing segregation costs associated with sourcing non-BE varieties between $103 million and $210 million. This includes record keeping plus segregation annually for food and dietary supplement manufacturers, and at $9 to $13 million annually for retailers. Up to now, we've discussed the scenario where no foods are exempt from the NBFDS, which is denoted as Scope 1. For the RIA, USDA examined two alternative assumptions about the scope of the proposed rule. First, USDA examined a scenario where sugars and oils are exempted. This is called Scope 2. Surprisingly, exempting oil or sugar or both from disclosure does not usually mean that the product is no longer subject to disclosure. This is because most processed food products contain ingredients other than oils and sugars that trigger disclosure. Exempting the sugar in a can of pasta sauce, for example, does not eliminate the need to label if the product also contains spices, modified food starch, xanthan gum, and citric acid. Due to the large number of multiple ingredient products, exempting sugar and oil doesn't reduce the number of labeled products by enough to affect the bottom line. There would be no noticeable difference in the number of labeled products resulting from a categorical exemption of oils and sugars. This is true for both food and dietary supplement manufacturers. Interestingly, there is also a slight increase in the modeled administrative cost of Scope 2 relative to Scope 1 due to a phenomenon USDA called shielding. Shielding results from the fact that disclosure is a binary decision. You either label or you don't. As such, the cost of deciding whether and how to label will be capped by the lowest administrative cost ingredient on a particular label. In other words, if you have BE corn flour, you will label the product before you need to worry about tracking down the BE status of your xanthan gum. To the extent that some of the oils and sugars are on the low administrative cost end of the spectrum, the administrative costs for an individual product could actually increase if the lower administrative cost ingredients are exempted. For Scope 2, USDA assumes that the moderate increase in administrative costs will be roughly equivalent to the moderate decrease in printing costs. As a result, for purposes of this RAA, the cost is presumed to be roughly the same under Scopes 1 and 2. The second alternative scope USDA examined is one that exempts from disclosure foods with undetectable recombinant DNA. This is called Scope 3. As described in the proposed rule under factors and conditions, under this alternative assumption, those foods where the modified genetic material cannot be detected would be excluded from the NBFDS. To demonstrate that modified genetic material cannot be detected, regulated entities would need to maintain records showing that food subjected to a specific process has been tested for the purpose by a laboratory accredited under ISO/ICE 17025. These are 2017 standards using methodology validated according to Codex Alimentarius guidelines. This alternative results in lower printing costs, but higher administrative costs and the addition of testing costs. The lower printing costs are due to a smaller number of products needing to be labeled. The higher administrative costs are due to two observations. First, administrative costs are incurred by manufacturers whether they eventually label or not. Second, the shielding effect discussed in the evaluation of Scope 2 plays a bigger role in Scope 3. Scope 3 presumes that all ingredients, except those very closely tied to the BE crop, for example, flours, raw crops, and unprocessed oils, and ingredients where the ingredient list is uninformative as to BE status, for example, spices and natural flavors, would be subject to test out of the disclosure requirement. The remaining list of ingredients that could trigger disclosure include few obvious ingredients that would short-circuit the manufacturer's assessment process and thereby reduce administrative costs. As a result, USDA estimates slightly higher administrative costs for Scope 3 than Scope 1 and 2. An additional cost that increases the total cost of Scope 3 is testing costs. Scope 3 allows manufacturers to demonstrate through evidence, including testing, that the ingredients in their product do not contain any rDNA. Using the bioengineered ingredient testing cost in the FDA label cost model, USDA estimates testing costs ranging from less than $1 million to $25 million annually, depending on purity threshold. USDA assumed that, as with Scope 1, food and dietary manufacturers would go non-BE for 20% of products subject to disclosure. However, since the universe of products subject to disclosure under Scope 3 is smaller than that for Scope 1, the cost of non-BE sourcing for 20% of products will also be smaller. For retailers, the cost of replacing BE with non-BE product would be exactly the same as in Scope 1, since the amount of potentially affected product is the same as in Scope 2. Now we're going to spend a little time discussing benefits. The proposed NBFDS is not expected to have any benefit to human health or the environment. As noted previously, in its 2016 review of the safety of BE plants, the United States National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine concluded that, quote, no differences have been found that implicate a higher risk to human health safety from these GE foods than from their non-GE counterparts, end quote. As a result, even if the new BE labels change the ratio of BE to non-BE food purchases, there would be no impacts on human health or the environment. Instead, the primary potential benefit of the proposed rule is the elimination of costly inefficiencies of a state-level approach to BE disclosure. Prior to the NBFDS, 7 states had voted on mandatory BE food labeling initiatives and 13 had pending initiatives. Vermont was the only state to successfully pass mandatory labeling legislation that was not conditioned on the passage of legislation in other states. In order to gauge the benefits of eliminating the inefficiencies of a state-level approach to BE disclosure, it is necessary to consider the regulatory baseline against which this proposed rule is being assessed. OMB Circular A4 states that, quote, baseline should be the best assessment of the way the world would look absent the proposed action. When more than one baseline is reasonable and the choice of baseline will significantly affect estimated benefits and cost, you should consider measuring benefits and costs against alternative baselines, end quote. This proposed rule is one for which assessment against multiple baselines would be informative for purposes of compliance with EO 1 Executive Order 12866 and Circular A4. USDA therefore examined 3 possible baselines. In this webinar, we present the analysis of one of these baselines, namely the baseline in which the Vermont labeling law is enacted. In this case, the benefits of the proposed rule would be the avoided costs of the Vermont BE labeling law. The Vermont BE labeling law required labeling of foods offered for sale in Vermont after July 1st, 2016, if they were produced with genetic engineering. Foods exempted from the Vermont rule included meat, milk, cheese, and foods certified as organic under the USDA's National Organic Program. The Vermont standard required segregation, certification, and documentation of supply chain management to document compliance. The rule required that transportation and storage systems be designed to segregate BE and non-BE foods. Though Vermont is a small state with less than 0.2% of the US population and 0.17% of the US GDP, industry leaders and analysts projected widespread application of its GE labeling standard. There are 3 primary reasons for this conclusion. First, even manufacturers that do not sell to Vermont could not ensure that their unlabeled products would be kept out of the state. For example, a Vermont grocer could directly import unlabeled canned peaches with BE sugar as an ingredient from a wholesaler in New Hampshire. Second, the Vermont law held manufacturers liable with significant monetary penalties up to $1,000 per day per product for a mislabeled product in the state, even if the manufacturer did not sell its product into the market. As a result, the manufacturer, not the importing grocery, would have been liable for mislabeled canned peaches from New Hampshire. Third, the production of different products for the Vermont market and for the rest of the country could create costly supply chain and manufacturing inefficiencies. These would be compounded if more states enacted separate BE labeling laws. For this baseline estimate, USDA assumed that manufacturers would comply with the Vermont BE labeling law for products sold in the Northeast region of the United States, but not for products sold only in other regions of the country. Using this assumption, USDA finds that the cost of the Vermont BE labeling law overall would be slightly higher than the cost of the proposed national BE labeling law. This result is driven by 3 observations. First, all manufacturers in the country will incur some administrative costs in figuring out if the Vermont BE law applies to them. Second, those manufacturers that need to comply with the Vermont law would face more expensive administrative costs than with the national BE law. The Vermont standard had 4 levels of compliance that were tied to the relative weight of ingredients in the final product. This complexity would make it harder for manufacturers to determine how to comply with the law. Third, the Vermont standard only allowed 12 months to comply, meaning that manufacturers would have difficulties syncing printing and applying the new labels with regularly scheduled labeling changes. This dramatically increases the cost of labeling. Manufacturers that pulled product from the Vermont market or to sync up with regularly scheduled labeling changes would incur the cost of lost products. In total, including costs for retailers and non-BE sourcing, USDA estimates that the total cost for the Vermont BE labeling law applied to products sold in the Northeast would be $126 million to $333 million at a 3% discount rate and $190 million to $565 million at a 7% discount rate. Okay, this concludes the webinar. As noted earlier in the webinar, comments on the proposed rule must be submitted by July 3rd. We ask that you please submit any comments through the rulemaking portal at regulations.gov. And please remember that comments submitted to the BE food disclosure at ams.usda.gov website will not be considered. We appreciate your time. Thank you very much.